On December 15, 1943, a train was traveling from Kansas City to New York when the person aboard it, who had been the most brilliantly alive presence in the car, the person whose laughter and conversation and the seemingly inexhaustible energy that those who knew him described as the primary characteristic of being in his vicinity, went quiet in a way that was not like him going quiet for ordinary reasons. Fats Waller had died in his sleep. He was 39 years old. The news moved through the jazz world with a specific speed that bad news moves through a world where everyone knows everyone, and where the loss of a central figure is felt immediately by the entire network of relationships that figure had inhabited. Louis Armstrong heard the news. Those who were with him when he heard it described his response with a specific word: quiet. Not the expressive grief of someone who responds to loss with an outward show of feeling, the quiet of someone for whom the fact of the loss has arrived in a place that precedes expression, that is more fundamental than what expression can reach. Fats Waller, Thomas Wright Waller, born in 1904, the son of a Harlem minister, had been, by the time of his death, one of the most recognizable musical figures in America. His recordings with his band, Fats Waller and His Rhythm, were among the most popular jazz recordings of the 1930s. His compositions, including Ain't Misbehavin', Honeysuckle Rose, and dozens of others that had entered the permanent landscape of American popular music, were part of the musical air that everyone in and around the jazz world breathed. But the recordings and the compositions, which were the public record of Waller's achievement, were the part of him that persisted. The part that those who knew him grieved, the part that Louis Armstrong went quiet for, was something that the recordings captured only imperfectly, because it was not primarily a recorded thing. It was a quality of presence, the specific energy that Waller produced in whatever room he was in, the humor and the warmth and the intelligence and the particular quality of joy that had in it none of the performed quality of someone putting on an entertaining face, and all of the genuine quality of someone for whom being in the world was, despite its complications, a fundamentally pleasurable experience. He had also, by 1943, been visibly wearing himself out for years in the way that people who live hard and work without rest and treat the body as an instrument to be used rather than maintained, eventually wear themselves out. The specific combination of schedules and habits and the physical demands of performing at Waller's level across the decade of the 1930s had produced a man who was, at 39, in a physical condition that those who were close to him had been worried about for some time. The death was not entirely surprising to those who knew him well. It was still, when it arrived, devastating. By 1943, the Harlem of the late 1920s was not the Harlem that Louis Armstrong and Fats Waller had known together. The specific cultural moment that had concentrated so much creative energy in that neighborhood, the combination of migration and musical tradition, and the particular social geography of Black New York that had produced the Renaissance, had not disappeared, but it had changed in the way that specific concentrated moments change, dispersed into the broader culture that it had fed, absorbed by the commercial structures that had learned to profit from it, continued in different forms in different places. The people who had been part of it were older. Some of them were gone. Waller had continued performing and recording through the 1930s with a level of commercial output that was impressive by any measure. The Fats Waller and His Rhythm recordings had made him one of the most recognizable figures in American popular music. He was famous. He was, by the standards of the commercial landscape, successful. He was also burning the candle, as those who knew him put it, at both ends, in the specific way of someone who operates at full capacity without the structural support, the rest, the health management, the reduction in the pace of things that sustained operation at full capacity requires. Those who were with him on the tour that ended in Kansas City in December of 1943 described a man who was very tired. Tired in a way that was visible if you were looking for it, though Waller himself was not the kind of person who made his tiredness a subject of conversation, or who allowed it to substantially alter the energy he brought to performances. He was 39 years old. He had been playing at the highest level of demand for more than 2 decades. The tiredness was the tiredness of a life fully deployed, with little reserved. The train left Kansas City on December 14th. It was headed for New York. Waller was aboard, sleeping. He did not wake up. The conductor found him in the morning. He was 39 years old, and the music that had not yet been written, the compositions and the recordings and the performances of an artist who was 39 and who had decades of productive life still ahead of him by any reasonable expectation, that music was simply not going to exist. This is the specific quality of early loss that those who grieve musicians grieve. Not only the person, but the work that the person would have done, the recordings that would have been made, the compositions that existed in Waller's mind and that he had not yet had the time to bring to the piano and to the recording microphone. The specific development of a talent that had not yet reached the point that sufficient years and continuing work would have brought it to. All of this was simply gone on a train in December, while everyone who would eventually miss it slept. Louis Armstrong received the news and went quiet. The quiet lasted for a time that those who were with him understood, without being told, not to interrupt. He was not going to explain what the quiet was about. The quiet was about something that did not require explanation to anyone who had known both men, who had been in the Harlem of the late 1920s, who understood what specific presences meant to the world that contained them, and what their absence produced in the world that remained. Louis Armstrong and Fats Waller had known each other from the Harlem years, from the period in the late 1920s and early 1930s, when both men were in the city, and the city was the center of something that the people inside it understood as significant, even as they were inside it. The Harlem of that period was, in the specific world of Black American music, the place where the music was alive in a particular way, where the rent parties and the clubs and the informal musical encounters of the neighborhood produced, on a nightly basis, the specific kind of creativity that emerges when talented people in a concentrated geography are in constant contact with each other's work. Waller was at the center of this. His piano was the instrument around which much of the Harlem musical life of the era organized itself. Not because he controlled or directed it, but because his playing had a quality that drew people in, and that other musicians found both electrifying and instructive. The stride piano tradition that Waller had absorbed and transformed was the foundational grammar of Harlem's keyboard culture, and Waller's command of it was sufficiently complete that those who heard him understood they were hearing someone who had not just learned the language, but was doing something original with it. Armstrong was not a pianist. His instrument was the trumpet, and the relationship between what he was doing on the trumpet and what Waller was doing on the piano was the relationship of two people in related areas of the same domain, close enough to recognize each other's achievement, different enough that the recognition carried genuine admiration rather than competitive comparison. They were not rivals. They were, in the specific taxonomy of Harlem musical life in the late 1920s, people who occupied adjacent positions in a world that was large enough for both of them and that was enriched by having both. The friendship that developed between them had in it the quality that friendships between musicians who genuinely respect each other's work sometimes have. the ease of people who have stopped needing to prove themselves to each other and can simply be in each other's company without the performance of competence that early professional acquaintance sometimes requires. They spent time together in the way that people who are in the same city and enjoy each other's company spend time, informally, without organized occasion, simply in the available hours between the obligations that their careers produced. What each saw in the other was not simply musical excellence, which both possessed in obvious abundance. What they saw was something more character-specific. In Waller's case, the specific quality of joy that he brought to everything he did, which was not the performed joy of an entertainer working a room, but the genuine article. The joy of someone for whom the music and the company and the business of being alive were, despite the specific difficulties that being a black musician in America in 1930 entailed, fundamentally worth having. And in Armstrong's case, Waller saw something that complemented his own quality, a seriousness about the music that did not produce solemnity, a commitment to craft that was visible in every note without ever becoming clinical, a warmth directed outward that was unmistakably the real thing. Two men, different in temperament and instrument and the specific shape of their creative personalities, who recognized in each other something worth staying near. What Fats Waller's death produced in Louis Armstrong, beyond the immediate grief, beyond the quiet that those who were with him observed and did not interrupt, was something more lasting and more specific. It was a recognition of the fragility of the generation. The people who had made the music of the 1920s and 1930s, who had been in the clubs and the studios and the rent parties and the touring cars that had produced what the subsequent decades would call the golden age of jazz, were not permanent. They were people. People who got tired and got sick and died on trains at 39, and whose specific presences in the world were not replaceable by the recordings they left behind, however good those recordings were. The recordings were what remained. The person was gone. Armstrong had known this in the abstract, in the way that all people know that people die. Waller's death made it specific and immediate in the way that the death of someone your own age and your own generation makes things specific and immediate. Not as a philosophical fact about the nature of life, but as the concrete reality of a world that is smaller by one specific person, in a way that the remaining people feel as a specific subtraction from the daily life of the music. The subsequent years of Armstrong's career were not visibly shaped by Waller's death in the way that a dramatic turning point shapes a narrative. Armstrong continued. He continued performing and recording and touring with the same commitment he had brought to these activities before December 1943. The music did not change. The schedule did not change. The warmth he brought to every room he performed in did not change. But the knowledge was there. The specific knowledge that the people who had been there at the beginning, who had made the Harlem of the late 1920s what it was, who had been present at the particular confluence of talent and place and historical moment that produced something that would take decades to fully understand. Those people were not going to be there forever. Some of them were already gone. Waller was 39. The others were not much older. The generation was not permanent, and the music that the generation had made would eventually need to be carried by people who had not been there when it was new. Armstrong carried it. He carried it for the rest of his career, 28 more years of playing and recording and touring into a musical landscape that changed around him in ways that made the distance from Harlem in 1929 feel very large. He carried it with the specific quality of someone who understands that what they are doing is both its own thing and the continuation of something that others began, and that the others who began it are owed a particular quality of attention in the continuing. Fats Waller died on a train at 39. Louis Armstrong heard the news and went quiet. The quiet was for a friend. It was also for something larger, for the recognition of what the generation was and what it was going to lose, and what it would mean to be the one who continued. Armstrong continued for 28 more years. He played Waller's compositions when the set list allowed it. He mentioned Waller's name when the conversation invited it, briefly, warmly, without elaboration. The way you mention the name of someone whose absence has become, over the years, simply part of the texture of the world you're living in. Present as an absence, there in the music, gone from the train.